Okay, so let's proceed to the creation of the world according to the Japanese tradition. Okay, so unlike the Chinese version, first of all, the Japanese creation myth does have a more or less unified canonical version, and it's to be found in these texts, specifically the Kojiki, which means the record of ancient matters. And this is the oldest known text in the Japanese language, although it's got heavily Chinese elements and influences. And what it is a compilation of oral stories and traditions that were recorded in writing by imperial decree around 712 CE, which is in what's called the Nara period. And that was a very crucial moment in the consolidation of the Japanese state and Japanese identity, drawing heavily on the Chinese model at the time, but which of course also included, as part of that process, the project to justify the rule of the Japanese emperors. That's to say, the Yamato dynasty. So, in that context, the Kojiki was very much a political creature. And what it does is it takes disparate myths and traditions and builds them into a single official narrative that stretches from the formation of the world through the age of the gods to the direct descent from those gods of the first human emperor Jimmu, and from there to the rather heavily mythologized history of Japan. It was followed a few years later by the other text here, the Nihon Shoki, also known as the Nihongi, and that means the Japanese chronicles. And what this did, it developed the material in the Kojiki with a few variations here and there, but also a more thorough account of the history. Taken together, these two texts form the basis for Japanese creation mythology, as well as for a lot of the cosmology of Shinto, which is Japan's indigenous animistic religion. So what do we have? Well, much as in the Chinese stories, the world, according to Japanese tradition, originated from a primordial chaos. And here you also have what they call the inyo in Japanese. That's the Japanese yin and yang, the cosmic dual forces, in which they were not yet separated. And as in the Chinese case, but entirely by themselves this time, the lighter part spread out to form the heavens, and the heavier part sank to form the earth. Okay, so separation of heaven and earth, and in the space between the separated heaven and earth, three gods, who are called kami in Japanese, coalesced, apparently spontaneously, followed by another two gods, and then another two again. So you have seven kami, and these seven kami are very obscure. They had extremely long names, they had no gender, and at any rate, they went straight into hiding and they're never mentioned again by name in the texts, so better to leave them alone for now. Then you got a further sequence of 10 gods in 5 pairs, also emerging spontaneously, although this time in each pair you have one male and one female. And they've also got long names, they're also really obscure. The real story starts with the fifth and last of these pairs. And these have much better known names. They are Izanami no Mikoto and Izanagi no Mikoto, who you might have seen in pictures and things, sort of staples of Japanese folklore. Here they are. Now, I have to give a content warning here. There is no way to disguise the fact that there is a hideous expression of misogyny in this story, one of the very worst, certainly that I've seen. Let's call it a Genesis class act of cosmic poisoning. And, I can't make any pretense to impartiality over this. Frankly, neither should you. Just got to give an advance warning because stuff like this is and probably should be traumatic to anybody who considers themselves a sapient being. Okay? Anyway. Story goes that Izanami and Izanagi stood upon the floating bridge of heaven, which you see here, and they looked with curiosity on the ocean beneath. Now, from those earlier gods, they had received, among other things, a great jeweled spear. And they thrust this spear down into the ocean and used it to churn the waters. And when they lifted it, the brine that was dripping off its tip coalesced, was rather coagulated into the first island, called Onogoro Shima. And the name is just a description of how it formed. Shima is island in Japanese. And whether that corresponds to an actual present island is the subject of huge debate, of course. There will be many contenders. Okay, it's a new island. And Izanami and Izanagi decided they liked the look of that island, and so they went down to live on it. They built a great support column there, which they called the Pillar of the Heavens. And around this Pillar of the Heavens, they built a great temple. So they were living in this temple, and while they were there, they also began to study their own bodies and each other's. And this was interesting, of course, and after a while, Izanagi suggested to Izanami, look at this. He said, my body has a part which has grown too much, and yours has a part which has not quite grown. Now, I'm thinking, if we combine my part and your part, we should be able to generate many lands and countries. What do you think about that? And Izanami agreed to this. I mean, it sounded worth a go. And perhaps because they felt this would be quite a significant act, they decided that they would precede it with a ceremony. What they would do is circle the pillar of the heavens in contrary directions and then have their intercourse when they met on the opposite side. Not much on the earth yet, so you don't have much choice when it comes to how you're going to have a grand ceremony, but there we go. Izanami went round one way, Izanagi went round the other, and they met on the other side, and there Izanami greeted Izanagi. She said, oh, I have met a truly delightful youth. And that's where it all apparently goes wrong. Because for some reason, Izanagi is very upset. And he says, how can you be the one who speaks first in greeting? I'm the man. The man has the right to speak first. How can you, the woman, be the first to speak? The point with this is that neither the Kojiki nor the Nihon Shoki, nor actually any extant record that I found, give any explanation for how or from where Izanagi came up with this principle. It's just, it's put out just like that, no attempt at justification. And of course, we can't just wave it away as somehow traditional or the values of the time or just the way things were, platitudes, because the masculinist power fantasy is nothing of the sort. It has to be called as an abomination that was created within history, still has ruinous consequences with which we all still live quite miserably and often die quite miserably today. So, there has to be an accountability process. Yeah, it's horrible. It's just shitty. So anyway, you go on with the story's now quite shameful, but to go on with it, they did mate despite all of Izanagi's protestations that it was unlucky because he hadn't been the one to speak first. So, Izanami insisted, they did it anyway, but they produced a child. And the records call this child Hiruko, which literally means the leech child. Hiru is a leech. If you've lived in Japan, especially if you've walked in the Tanzawa Mountains, for example, you'd have probably learned that the hard way sooner or later. Hiru, the leech. And since they considered him unlucky, what did they do? They put him in a reed boat and they abandoned him to the ocean currents. As the responsible parents they were. And bit of a tangent, but they say he was unlucky. But you know what? This leech child, popular folklore holds that he grew into the beloved Ebisu, who's the laughing god, as they call him. And he's a god of great fortune. Business people pray to him. People in the fishing industry in particular pray to him, if they're seeking a bountiful catch. So, unlucky, judge for yourself, I'd say. Although, knowing what they did to him as a child, that casts his wonderful smile in a whole new light, doesn't it? Think about it anyway. Okay, so in the meantime, Izanami and Izanagi consulted with the gods, and then they apparently gave their blessing to Izanagi's ego. They said, yeah, he should have spoken first. He's the man. I bet this was all. I bet it was actually different originally, and then later patriarchal interest tacked this on. But anyway, no explanation. Yeah, so they tried it again. They went round the pillar again. This time, Izanagi, the male, spoke first in greeting, and then they procreated once more. And this time, apparently, they produced 8 islands. And you can see them here. The islands were the Awaji Islands, Iyo, which is now known as Shikoku, 4 countries, the Oki Islands, Tsushima over here, Iki Islands, and then the big ones. You have Tsukushi, which is now known as Kyushu. You have Sado, which is meant to be quite nice. My university there, they did some, when I was in Japan, they did some sort of agricultural field work there. It's meant to be quite pleasant. And of course, Yamato, which is now known as Honshu, the big island. And all of these exist today. Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu are the 3 principal islands of Japan. Notice, by the way, they do not include Hokkaido. and they do not include the Ryukyu Islands, where you have Okinawa. Both had indigenous peoples, and they would be outside the Japanese sphere until much more recent times. Genocide. Anyway. So, Izanami and Izagi went on to procreate more. They produced more islands, more, rivers, mountains, trees, and then a bunch of new gods as well, who would go and inhabit these new lands. And this next set of gods is very important too, although the sources differ on how they came about. The Nihon Shoki says they were simply born as part of this same sequence. But the older Kojiki puts their creation at the end of a whole other part of this story. And this part involves a descent into the underworld. So here we are. This is the entrance to the underworld. This is in Shimane Prefecture in the southwest. This is held as the entrance to the underworld. You've got a sort of tourist information stone there, a nice explanation about it. And apparently what happened was that one of these new gods was the fire god, Kagutsuchi. And, think about it, giving birth to a fire god, it's going to hurt. Apparently, it so badly burnt Izanami that she died from her injuries. And at this, Izanagi, I mean, for all that he so clearly cared about her previously, apparently now he got all furious, grief, rage. What did he do? He chopped up his son Kagutsuchi into pieces. And again, as an aside, those pieces apparently became volcanoes, which are also a tremendously important part of Japanese life. And apparently he was so bereft, so desperate, that he then set out to Yomi, the world of the dead, in hopes of getting Izanami back. And so he, went down to the underworld, he delved through the shadows, too dark to see, and there he found her. He found Izanami. And she told him it's too late. She's already eaten the underworld's food, so there's no chance of her accompanying him back to the world of the living. She was where she belonged now. So Izanagi was distraught at this, but at some point, a stray light, some say one he lit himself, or maybe it came through a crack in the rock, fell on Izanami and suddenly revealed her appearance to him now. What do you expect? She's dead. So she had rotting skin, creatures wriggling through holes in it, so forth. And at this, Izanagi was just so horrified. He ran off screaming back to the surface, which, of course, was a huge humiliation for Izanami. She, wasn't going to accept that. So she called up an undead army, and with it chased him angrily all the way back to the surface. And he just made it out just in time, at which point he then blocked off the entrance to the underworld using a huge boulder, and thereby separated the worlds of the living and the dead. Quite a monumental moment, but the story doesn't actually end there. They scream curses through the rock at each other. They threaten each other's children for a while. I mean, you're probably getting the sense these really aren't exemplary parent figures. If you're not, then see me at the end, by the way. And then what Izanagi does is he feels he's all sort of filthy and tainted from this experience, so he holds a purification ritual to cleanse himself. And according to the Kojiki, it's during this purification ritual that he gives birth to the next three gods. And they come from his eyes and his nose. And these three are very, very important. They are, first of all, the sun goddess Amaterasu Omikami, who comes from his left eye. There's the mysterious moon god Tsukuyomi, gender unclear, who comes from his right eye. And the temperamental Susanoo, the god of the seas and the storms, who comes from his nose. Now, of these three, the sun goddess Amaterasu, whose name means she who illuminates the heavens, is probably the single most important Shinto deity. There's a whole further saga of stories around her we don't really have time to go into. It's quite gratuitous, quite spectacular, actually, so do have a look if you get the chance. There's more gender trouble. There's bodily fluids and defecations flying about, quite literally, mostly because of Susanoo. Susanoo gets banished, and then there's a whole business of when Amaterasu furiously shuts herself in a cave and refuses to come out. And because she's the sun goddess, that means the sun no longer comes out. So all the other gods, as you see here, they have to go to such enormous trouble to find a way to convince her to come out again. Yeah. But eventually, her story shifts towards her appointments of further deities to pacify those islands on the earth. And then these gods settle there, they establish their rule there, and in a few generations, they have a descendant who leads an army to conquer the great island of Yamato. And that is its first emperor, the legendary Jimmu, who does exactly that. And then he establishes the imperial house of Yamato, that is to say, Japan. And he founds it at the city of Nara, which conveniently is the seat of the imperial house at the time the Kojiki was written. Total coincidence, I'm sure. And with that, the mythic age of gods transitions into the more historical age of humans. Okay, so that's also probably quite a lot to take in. What do we take from all this? Well, again, we've seen the recurrence of some of the same familiar themes from world creation stories, but there's probably a few things that come across again as very distinct to the Japanese myths. I notice for one thing, there's no threshold moment in this one where gods created humans. There's no shaping of the bodies from clay, there's no breathing life into them. There's very little really about the emergence of humans as a form of life separate from gods at all. On top of that, it's probably worth noting the very concept of gods in Japanese, the kami, is actually quite a lot more complex and profound than in worldviews that strictly separate gods from humans or from the natural world. Shinto is animistic. Kami are very much of nature. They're not above it or separate from it. What's curious about humans is it's really as though it's assumed they were just there. They were just emerging and multiplying in the background in the course of all these stories, perhaps as part of that broader natural scene. What we do get explicit, though, is the connection between these creation narratives and, as we saw in the Chinese case, the narratives of human political
Thanks.
legitimacy.
Okay.
Perhaps actually even more overtly in this case than in the Chinese case. We have the fact that the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, the first written repositories of these myths, were explicitly commissioned to harness these stories in order to strengthen the imperial government's claim to the throne. That was their overriding purpose, their claim to power. Sorry, and that again raises questions about whether, in doing that, they fidgeted with the original oral material that they received. So there's probably parallels here with what the monks did with the Irish materials. And we have, of course, how for most of history, it's been the official line that the Japanese emperor, who's still arguably the head of the oldest continuous hereditary monarchy in the world, and one of the most popular still, which is not insignificant, is supposedly a divine being. In these stories, the emperor is a divine being ruling by divine ordinance on account of his or her literal descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. And you'll probably be aware that this conviction, and along with the perhaps more exceptionalist tendencies that these myths inform more broadly, got the Japanese into enormous and quite bloody trouble in the age of 20th century racism and nationalism. And that's why when we say the emperor's divinity was the official line for most of history is actually very specific. It means until the 1st of January 1946, because on the 1st of January 1946, as part of the post-World War II settlement under the US occupation, the Showa Emperor Hirohito issued the Humanity Declaration. And it's called the Humanity Declaration because it declared, quite astonishingly, that the emperor is in fact human. Or in other words, the emperor's position, and this is quoting it, is not predicated on the false conception that the emperor is divine and that the Japanese people are superior to other races and fated to rule the world. Despite which, there's many Japanese nationalists who argue to this day that the foreigners misinterpreted this. The emperor still is, in fact, literally descended from the gods we've been talking about this evening. Oh, and this nationalism, by way of addendum, is now resurgent in the context of a stagnant long-term political scene, confrontations with the rising authoritarian China, the receding of the US, which still provides Japan's security umbrella, at least in theory, and the broader atmosphere of the rise of authoritarian nationalism worldwide. And these are the same people who, when they last had their way with power, killed probably some 30 million people and committed some of the worst mass atrocities of the masculine power fantasy in human history. Hello, Izanagi again. And they still show real trouble in expressing that they're sorry about it, if they are. Okay, lots to chew on there, I suppose. I'm sure you'll find lots to debate. So, whether you're talking about gender or power or nature or mortality, earth and water, so forth. I think if there's one thing we can all agree on, it's that this stuff matters and matters very much. Thank you.